Anybody picked up on some interesting things today? Hands up. Anybody would like to go home and actually implement those great ideas? Some of you? And this is a crazy thing. I know this is not going to happen to you guys, but in conferences around the world, people are saying exactly the same thing. And you know what they go back and do? Absolutely nothing. And it's quite extraordinary because there's no doubt that, did you go to Kevin's talk, any of you? Yeah? And the ideas about autonomous teams, right? We love those ideas. We love reducing dependencies across organizations. We can actually have people, small groups of people delivering real value out to real customers. And then we go back and we face those dependencies and we do absolutely nothing about them. So that's the idea of this talk. So how can we put a system in place so that we will actually drive real continuous improvement? And we will actually get to the place where we can use all these nice ideas and principles, not just to feel good about ourselves for a day here at a conference, but actually to do real change for real customers, real teams out in real life. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this talk is based on 7 years of working with Toyota Kata from a small isolated event in 2012 and until a large-scale thing going on in 2017 and 18, implementing Kata across an entire 700 people company across all levels. So it seems that sometimes improvement is just not invited to the party. It's like the last half a beer, you can go and have that, and you can go and dance on the dance floor, but the music is not there anymore. That's the kind of attention improvement you get. And that's a real shame because if we cannot optimize for doing things better tomorrow, there's a fair chance we're not going to survive tomorrow because it's not what we can do today, it's our ability to improve faster than our competitors really get opportunities that are going to make it possible for us to be And then we tend to have this notion that, yes, now we'll do Scrum. And in Scrum there's this sense of this notion of Scrum Master. And that Scrum Master is going to be great. And that Scrum Master is going to drive improvement, make sure that our team can set ambitious goals and actually deliver them. And the problem is that then we go out into those big organizations, we find that most of those Scrum Masters, they're just asking, what do you think? There's no expertise, there's no element of being this lean, agile expert that can actually help drive improvement, but instead we get people just asking teams and organizations, what do you think? That's not exactly what was written in the Scrum Guide. Something about guiding, coaching, leading the organization in change, but it's just not happening. It's not because Scrum Masters are stupid. It's because these organizations, they do not recognize now the potential, nor provide people with the career path, the support, the training, the coaching necessary to take on that big responsibility. Okay, and then, sorry. And then the excuse is always, but the teams always know best. The organization knows best, so all I can do is just facilitate. Sorry guys, just not good enough. And then we have a problem focus. So it becomes much less about what we want to achieve and much more about what problem did we face yesterday. We had a bad sprint review. Or this customer did not like our product. How can we fix that isolated event? But it's not from the perspective of the bigger picture. How can we reduce those dependencies? How can we establish a continuous feedback loop with our customers? How can we, as Kevin said, quantitatively measure whether we are creating an effect or not? Those are big things, and they do not just arrive by magic from run sprints or iterations. And again, as Russ Ackhoff said, removing what you don't want does not necessarily give you. And then there's this really, and I know it's not going on here, but imagine a world where people are starting to measure their agile success in terms of how many interdependent teams they can create in something called a release train. So how can we create non-independent teams? How can we make sure that they all need to plan together? How can we make sure that they don't have the freedom to decide on the length of their iterations? They don't have to decide on what they're doing because we can package all this in what we call a scale framework. And it's not that that's bad, because sometimes we need to live with that, because we do need 10 teams working together create a shared success. But in a lot of the scale initiatives I've seen, you don't need that, but you did not take the time to try to reduce the dependencies. Instead, you provide this incredibly big process wrapper to handle them instead. So remember to focus on the ultimate goal that we're trying to establish. Okay, so what is Toyota Kata then, and how is it different? As you probably guessed, as many of the other lean techniques and principles, it's from Toyota. The kata part is a bit more difficult. How many of you have practiced martial arts? A few. So those of you that have practiced martial arts will be familiar with repeating the same motions again and again and again. And we do that to build up muscle memory so that it becomes a part that we can do without much conscious effort. And the problem with improvement as we're doing it right now, it becomes this project approach. So we wake up every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks and then, suddenly we have to do process improvement. And then suddenly it becomes something that's scary and it stresses our brain because we're really just used to doing a lot of user stories. And as long as we can do user stories, then we're safe and everything is going well. And suddenly our brain has to deal with improvement. And improvement is kind of special because it's no longer about the individual piece of customer value. It's about being able to do all the future pieces of customer value in a better way. And that stresses our brain if it's not used to it. So that's why we want to build up this notion of muscle memory for process improvement. But naturally, coming from Toyota, some things are different because it's built in a different form of organization. So in the Western world, or in the world in general, we have this tendency to look at management as something it's about making decisions. It's about making sure that we've got the budgets in place. It's about making sure that we can hire and fire the right people. But in Toyota, it's very different. You get those responsibilities as well. But the main focus of a manager in Toyota is to make sure that you're constantly creating better environments for your teams and your employees to succeed. And if you fail in that simple task, then there's no possibility of advancement in the organization. But what do we do then? Because Toyota is primarily a manufacturing company. Yes, we can learn something from their product development as well, but their main area of expertise is trying to do this in a context where we're generating the same product again and again and again. And we're doing something different. If we do the same user story twice, probably we don't have a lot of customers out there being happy that we implemented the same ability to press the same kind of button 2 times, right? So it's a different scenario, and we have to deal with a different value stream, because if we've implemented Agile correctly, then we've actually got a situation where individual teams can produce individual value without having to interface with the rest of the world. But in a manufacturing context, often it's at this value stream level where a manager will then be responsible for the entire value stream consisting of multiple teams or yourselves to deliver value. So how do we do that? And how do we create what we call a starter kata for Agile organization, a way to get started with systematic continuous improvement? I don't know if you're aware of it. It's late now and it's approaching lunch also, but still, by just having one picture of a cute animal in this slide deck, you're going to rate my presentation 15% better than you had without this slide. So thank you, and let's move on to the next one. Using Toyota Kata, we've got something called the improvement kata, and I'll try to walk you through it. But basically, it's about understanding where do you want to go. Then finding out, compared to where we want to be, where are we right now? Compared to where we are right now, what would then be an ambitious next process improvement goal to set for ourselves? And then iterating towards that goal, acknowledging that it's an uncertain path towards this. To do that, we need to have quite a lot of elements in place. So first of all, we actually need to know what we're aiming for. And this is where it becomes incredibly important to start this dialogue also with the management layers above the teams. Because if they do not know what type of organization you're aiming for, then you're going to hit that glass ceiling that Kevin and a number of the other speakers also talked about. So what does perfection look like in an organization? Are we aiming for stable end-to-end teams with 100% allocation? Are we aiming to always be releasable, fully automated and on demand? Could be. Do we want to have the ability in our organization to slide scope vertically so we can deliver actual value to our customers in less than 3 days from getting a great idea and to having it into a production environment? And a number of other things. But the important thing is that if you do not agree on this level, then no matter how much Scrum, Safe, Kanban, whatever you put on top of it, you're not going to be aligned in terms of what type of organization you're trying to create. So that's the first part of Kata, actually knowing where you want to go. Then we want to find out where we are. And that's probably where most organizations fail, because they go straight into problem solving, straight into trying to deliver on without really understanding what's the point we're starting from. And it doesn't have to be days and months of analysis, but it does require some effort to find out, okay, so we wanted 100% allocation to the team, but right now it's at 27%. We wanted teams to be end-to-end, being able to cover the entire value stream, cross-functional and all that, but really only 30% of our teams are. We wanted work to flow smoothly from starting work and on delivering to the hands of customers, but we now find that 60% of our started work, that's blocked for more than a day. And we found out that only 20% of our user stories represent end-user value. The rest are just technical tasks, horizontal slices framed and misguided use of the user story concept. And a lot of other stuff. And the great thing from a CADA perspective, that is not a problem. It's just a starting point. And the lower your starting point, the more improvement potential you've got. But it is starting to acknowledge what is our real current situation, where we're starting from. Because if we know where we're starting from, then we can start to systematically improve where we want to be. And it sounds incredibly simple, but people just get it wrong. They go straight into problem solving, and sometimes we find that there are no problems at all. So given that you find that you want to reduce the number of defects, but the number of defects that you're actually experiencing is very, very low, that's probably not the best place to start your improvement work. Okay, so once we've found out where we want to go, where we are, now we're starting to think about, okay, what could be an ambitious goal to move to? And we might find that, okay, can we move from having 3 projects in progress to 2 projects in progress per employee? That's still an incredibly bad situation, right? But it's much, much, much better than it was when we had 3 projects in progress. Could we find that if we could move from 20% to 60% of things that we're working on to actually represent end-user value? It's still not 100%, but it's a lot better than only having the 20% being this user-centric, customer-centric approach, right? Could we move from 25 to 30% of our teams being end-to-end? Still not perfect, but still much better than the world we were coming from. And other types of improvements like this. But suddenly improvement does not become this vague idea of we want to do better. We want to have better and more customer-centric approach. We need to actually be able to observe what does a more customer-centric approach truly mean. And are we getting closer to that? Because to be honest, a lot of the improvement talk going on in organizations, that is just talk. Nothing real happens. And it becomes this reactive problem-solving approach where we experience a problem last week, and then suddenly it takes the entire attention of our teams, of our efforts, of our managers. And that's just a shame if there was really another goal that would be much, much, much more important to strive for. Does it make any sense? A few nods. You don't have to nod. Great. Okay. But then people run straight into this problem of, okay, so if we want to set this ambitious goal, then we need a clear path, a clear plan on how to get there. Am I doing something wrong here? I don't know. And the point of CADA is that as with product development, improvement is an iterative journey. So you can, if you set an ambitious goal, then there's a reason it's ambition. It's because you don't know the path on how to get there yet. So that is perfectly okay. You should find it both realistic and you should find it ambitious, but you do not need to know the path to get there. That is for you to plan, experiment your way to. Okay? And now we get to look at obstacles, but not until we know where we're heading, where we are, and where we want to be in the near term. Before that, we do not talk about all the problems. That is the point in time where we can do it, because now it's suddenly related to something we want to achieve, and not just a vague statement of a problem or an ambition. So for example, it could be that we want to get from the 60% to the 30% of the started work being blocked in a few days. That's a 50% reduction in the amount of work that's being blocked as we execute. But the problem is that this response time from the subject matter experts, that's right now 2 to 3 days. It could be that we want to move from 20% to 40% of our user stories representing end user value, but we have no idea how to slice vertically. But now we can deal with that problem, and we have a clear goal, and we can validate whether our solutions will actually move us closer towards that goal. And now it's focus. And that's a lot about the thing we've been talking about today, has to do with focus. But now we're talking about focus on improvement. So all that stuff we can do, and no matter how mature you are, get any person from the outside to come and have a look, and they'll have 100 things that they think you can do better. But we want to focus on the few things we need to do better to achieve our goal, not all the other noise, because that will allow us to actually deliver on the most important things, where we can now suddenly have real user interaction when we finish user story. Measure quantitatively if we're actually getting the desired effect of what we're doing. Having the end-to-end teams, or whatever goal that we're trying to focus on. And now, once we get to that point, now we can start to actually run the small, focused experiments to see if we're improving the situation. So, for example, let's imagine that the response time is 2 to 3 days from the external stakeholders that we do need. You could argue, why do we not bring those people into the team? But if specialization is high, if they're outside our organization, if the frequency of when we need them is low, and if 1 week we need one person and 2 months after it's a different person, and if it changes every week, then it becomes very difficult to have that person in the team, because it does not make any sense to have them 95% of the time just sitting there doing nothing. But we get a great idea to experiment with this, visualizing the actual questions we have on a Trello board and tagging these stakeholders. And then we plan very specifically, and this is what we sometimes call the plan, do, check, adjust method. So what are we going to do, and when is it going to happen? So in this case, March 3rd to 4th, and the responsible person is John. What do you expect from getting this? We expect that 2 subject matter experts will be tagged for 2 questions, and the response time for those 2 questions will be less than a day. What actually happened? We tagged 2 subject matter experts, but we got no response whatsoever. What did we learn? We learned that they actually could not find out how to get into the system. But we're validating this in 2 days, so we get to take a newer and better approach now, because maybe we should actually tell them in a better way how to use Trello, maybe we should provide a guide, whatever experiment could be the next step. But instead of waiting 2 weeks until we conclude that this was a failed experiment, we get the response immediately after executing it. So basically, for every experiment we do, we run through the small session of what will you do, what do you expect, what happened, and what did we learn. And a big benefit of doing this is that we're teaching our brains to cope with stress, because improvement is a stressful activity when we're not used to it. And failing is also a stressful activity when we're not used to it. So suddenly, and we see that time and time again, in the beginning, those pink stickers signaling that an experiment failed sounds dangerous. Oh my God, we failed again. But suddenly, people are starting to be proud of those pink stickers because they learned something quickly. And previously, it might have taken them 2 weeks to execute this small learning loop. And now suddenly, they've got that information already in a day or 2. So some of the questions we start to ask ourselves when we want to plan for these short learning loops. For example, Carl won't be here tomorrow. Can Henrik do it instead? Can we call them now instead of sending an email later? What is keeping us from trying out pair programming for 2 hours already tomorrow and validating how that went? It doesn't have to be the full experiment. It doesn't have to solve the entire obstacle. It's just the short learning loop to teach ourselves to experiment and to teach our brains that it's okay to fail. It's not dangerous, it's safe. Just go ahead, learn fast, get fast feedback, move on. And lots of other examples. As you've probably gathered by now, you cannot use Kata without making things measurable. And I think it's back to Kevin's point earlier today. Data beats opinion every single time. It's the same thing with process improvement. If you cannot get basic metrics in place to show you where you're going, if you're improving and if you're solving the right stuff, then it's very likely that you're simply working on stuff that is not going to be very valuable neither to you or to your customers. So a simple graph like this should be something we're able to show if you're working with Kata. And then the reaction will often be, yeah, but that takes time. And it does. But it doesn't have to be perfect. It might be that if you're in a manufacturing world and it's really important if things are taking you 15 or 17 and a half seconds to pass through your production line, that exact metrics are important. But when we're dealing with such a high degree of uncertainty and our flow is much slower, it just has to be good enough. And often we're dealing with orders of magnitudes of improvement. So if you want to improve from 7 to 85, it doesn't matter whether you started with 7 or 8.5 or 6. Just has to be good enough. Because then we can do real validation. But to do this, on the team level, we do need strong process leads, or in Scrum, what you would call a Scrum Master, to drive this process. Because selecting the next goal, investigating the current situation, finding that data, driving the improvement work, making sure that every single day you ask yourself the simple questions: are we executing our experiments? If we've executed some of them, what did we learn from it? Stuff like that. That is something that actually requires real time and effort. And it also requires expertise, because it requires people, process leads, that know enough about Agile to make sure that you do not just choose the easier option of slicing scope horizontally, which might make perfect sense from the individual team member's perspective, because suddenly they can move this post-it to done much faster, because now they completed the back-end task, or the test task, or the whatever task. It might be that from the individual's perspective, it makes a lot more sense to work on bigger items. But we need people that can tell us that is not an option if you're working with Lean and Agile, because batch size is something we want to reduce, not something we want to increase. But having those strong opinions and being able to push the team and actually set the bars higher and aligning those bars with actual core Lean Agile principles does require real knowledge, and not just being able to ask, what do you think, guys? And it's fair enough that if you spend 5 years at college trying to become the best programmer or UX designer or whatever, that you're more interested in those aspects of expertise than Lean and Agile. But we do need people on the team that shows a different path. Okay, so imagine an organization where you could ask any manager, any team, these 5 questions, and you would get a clear response. What are you trying to achieve? If it's from the manager's perspective, maybe they're working with the structure. Maybe they're trying to reduce the amount of dependencies between teams so they can work more autonomously. Maybe they're trying to put together a setup so that it would be much, much easier for teams to get fast feedback from their customers, or whatever they could be involved in on the structural level that can be very difficult for the individual team to address. Where are you now, based on real data? What obstacle is in your way? What is your next step? And when can we go and tell whether that next step was an improvement or not? And that's the basis of what we call the coaching kata. So we've got the improvement kata we just went through, and then we've got the coaching kata. We've got a system where managers will consistently ask teams, how are we doing, guys? Are we improving? High-level manager will ask lower-level managers, how are you doing in terms of making your organization more lean and agile? What is your direction? What is your focus right now? And can I see some metrics, data, showing that you've actually created a better environment for your teams to succeed? So basically, trying to put it all together, my dream is that we will start to recognize those things on your left for what they truly are. A great toolbox of nice process methods, tools and techniques that we can use, but we only use them to support what we really truly want, which is the core Agile principles. We're not aiming to become Scrum, we're not aiming to become safe, but we will gladly use those practices, roles, principles, if they can support where we're going. And then we have this strong improvement engine to the right here that will help us actually get there. And we've proven time and time again now that without that engine, we just fail to deliver on these principles once they become part of daily life and we're beyond that honeymoon period where the whole organization is focused on let's become more agile. And also that we acknowledge that the stuff down here, what customers care about, they're what we call lagging indicators. So we cannot really trust ourselves to just focus on those alone, because it's not going to be something we can influence directly. But from focusing on the stuff up here, we will get the culture and mindset, and we will get the end user value of what we're doing. Make sense? Cool. And then a last point. Don't escalate, facilitate. So take ownership of your improvements. Don't just leave it actual ownership. Do not think, how quickly can I escalate this problem to higher level management so I don't have to deal with it. If you find yourself, then facilitate the decision of fixing that problem. Do not just escalate it. And just to show a very simple but actually quite powerful story showing you that this is really not rocket science. So we had a team, great team, but very stressed out. And they were not really that engaged in participating in kata training, to be honest. They thought it was a bunch of bullshit, and they wanted to do something else, and they wanted to go back and be stressed about all the stuff that they wanted to do, but couldn't make in time. And then we started to talk about this ideal future state. Where do you want to be, guys? And we started to go through these aspects of the core lean agile principles, and suddenly the whole atmosphere in the room started to change, because once they saw that there was a real system out there where there would be one place to see priorities, one place to see work in progress, and a WIP limited system that would keep new things from arriving if you could not finish what you've started. That dream scenario, if they could get there, suddenly it started to make a lot of sense to them. Because we had a chance to go look at their situation. It turned out for them to see what was the highest priority to work on, they had to go to 7 different places. Each individual, if you had to find out the most important thing to work on for the team, 7 places. And if you had to go and find out what you had actually put in progress, you had to go to 5 different places. And the average work in progress for a 6-people team was 32 items. Not surprised that they were stressed out. So they set themselves some clear goals, and within 2 months they went from 7 to 1 place to identify priorities, from 5 to 1 place to track work, and from 32 to 9 on average WIP. And that was not easy, because they had to deal with the entire outside interface of customers using the wrong places to address stuff, from walk-ins, from managers, from people not aligning with how they want to work. So it was definitely required a lot of failed experiments, but they got there. And we could also tell that they actually got something out of it, because the average throughput rose from 6 to 11 story points per week. And they managed to do this even further. So once they decreased WIP even further, they got beyond that double throughput. And naturally, velocities and throughput is it's an easy measure to gain. So make sure that you focus on improving the top, and then just use the bottom here to recognize whether you made a result or not. Okay, so I wrote a book about this. From these 7 years of experience, it's called Level Up Agile with Toyota Kata, Beyond Method Wars, Establishing Core Lean Agile Capabilities Through Systematic Improvement. And if you find yourself in either an extremely mature Kata setup or a distributed team, then a bunch of guys and me got together and developed a small tool so that you can do this online as well. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.